oatmeal
Tell
tea.
me something, Corrigan. Tell me a tale. Weave
Oh,
me a yarn. You
I would
know,
be happy to do that for you, Mark. I'm really glad you asked.
fucking draw me in, reel me in. You've got me on the hook. Now all you have to do is just fucking reel me in. I'm yours. Tell me something.
I will do my very best to
Take
reel
me
you in, good sir.
places.
And Mark, I'm going to warn you in advance. This is a little bit of a nerdy one.
All right.
You know that I've said before that at some point I would really like to delve into the assassination of President James A. Garfield.
Mm.
And that time's not today, but it is coming soon. What I am, oh, go ahead.
Why Garfield in particular? Why does that particular assassination capture you so?
Oh, because it's so complicated. There's so
All right.
much at play that led to Garfield dying the way that he did, part of which we will go into this fine day.
Nice.
Not the least of which is just kind of where medicine was at the time, and the fact that his death was excruciating and took place over the course of something like 80 days.
Yikes.
Yeah, as he just slowly shriveled into a husk of a man over
Ugh.
that time.
Okay, I
James
look forward to
Garfield
that.
didn't need to die. He didn't need to die,
Okay.
but he did.
All
And the
right.
story is interesting. So I'll
That
get
one
there.
is for a future episode of Jack of all Trades, a future Joag.
Exactly. But today I am going to just set a little more context to that bit by bit, just, peppering in the context. So when I do get to tell this story, people will know everything that they need to know already. So this story is in fact related to the murder of our 20th Commander-in-Chief. I'm going to tell you about a place where his assassin, Charles Guiteau, spent several years of his life, a utopian community in upstate New York called Oneida. Now, does the name Oneida ring any bells to you?
It doesn't, and neither does Charles Guiteau.
Guiteau, yes.
Is that one name? Is that one word?
Guiteau. Guiteau.
Guiteau, right. No, it doesn't ring a bell.
Okay, well, for some listeners, Oneida might ring a bell because you've seen it on like stainless steel silverware that maybe your mom keeps in the closet, or you've seen it at a friend's house or in department stores and things like that. And that silverware is indeed a product of this very commune that came about in the 19th century.
Okay.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Now, I don't know about the UK, Mark, but in America in the 19th century, it was a hotbed of religious offshoots of Christianity, spurred in part by the Second Great Awakening, which had seen Protestant revival take hold throughout the US from the late 1700s into the 1830s. And to be fair, from like the moment the English got here, allegedly for religious freedom, although they had religious freedom in Holland, they just, it wasn't enough religious freedom. They wanted to dominate, and they didn't like that their kids were becoming too Dutch. Anyways, folks started splitting off and doing their own thing and believing in different theologies and starting new groups and even colonies, because the OGs were not thrilled with deviation from what they were doing when they came to America. So you had all these people who came to America for ostensibly religious freedom, but they didn't want religious freedom for everyone. And if you deviated from their specific brand of Christianity, you were pretty much banished. You've seen The Witch.
Of course, yes. Yeah. It's our way or the highway, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. In The Witch, these people have different ideas about God, and thus they end up in the woods. If you had different ideas about how God worked, off to the woods with you. And if no one agreed, it was off to the woods by yourself, like in that movie. But there were certainly religious sects that were able to spring up and do all right for themselves. And that tradition lived and lives on in America. Today, it's estimated that there are over 200 Christian denominations in the US alone.
It's too goddamn many.
It's too many.
It's way too, it's like 199 too many.
Yeah.
And would I be right in saying that every one of those circa 200 denominations is convinced that theirs is the right one and that the others are wrong?
Oh, of course. I mean, well,
the fuck is that?
Not necessarily denominations like that. Denominations generally provide at least a little leeway in theology.
Wiggle room, okay.
So yeah, it's not necessarily that like people in different denominations think ones and others are like going to hell or anything like that. A Baptist doesn't think a Lutheran's going to hell. They just think they've got the theology wrong. That's all.
All right. Okay. Fine.
Yeah. So there's the 200 of those, and that doesn't count ones that are offshoots that come from Christianity. but we don't count as Christian. Those are the ones that are going to hell, like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for example, which you know as Mormons. And that came about in the 1830s when, because of that Second Great Awakening, people were primed for the snake oil that Joseph Smith was selling. So all that to say, the US is a country with a long history of folks having their own revelations about Christianity and then fucking off to do their own thing where they won't get flack for it. Because if you were in the wrong place, they'd just, fucking hang you. You don't want that. So at this point in the 1800s, we're also rubbing up against industrialization and urbanization in America, and people are moving from the country into the city. The church has way less sway in people's lives. They're going out for leisure and intermingling, boy-girl hangouts. When America was more of an agricultural place, life was all about the family and the church and these small communities, and so communities and the church had a lot of control over the norms of society. But
where are we now chronologically? What year is this? Where are we?
We're talking about like the mid 1800s.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And so obviously when society starts to change, people inevitably freak out and try to mitigate the apparent damage. And the US is still new at this point, right? We become a country in the 1770s. And we weren't sure exactly what we were going to be yet, but we knew we wanted to be something not European. That was about all we had.
To me, that is fucking mad. That you're only your nation is only a few hundred years old.
Yeah, right? Isn't that bonkers?
That's fucking crazy shit.
Yeah, and we think we've got it all figured out. We just got here. It's
not that I'm saying that being an older country means fuck all. It doesn't. It means nothing.
Yeah.
But your history is
it's short.
Very recent. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. The church that I would stay when I was in Northern Ireland is older than this country. So yeah. At this point, as Hector St. John de Crevecoeur famously asked, what then is the American, this new man? And this question not only impacted our ever-growing and ever-industrializing society, but also smaller groups of people who saw an opportunity to create utopia here on Earth. And John Humphrey Noyes was just one such figure. He reckoned that the second coming of Christ had already happened with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And as such, he wanted to embrace the communal living demonstrated by early Christian communities in order to strive for a better society and usher in the kingdom of heaven on earth. And while this is where the ideal started, before long, the Christian foundation of his beliefs pretty much eroded, and the community he created became a wholly more secular endeavor. And I mean, basically, Mark, it became a sex cult.
Oh, okay.
In 1862, Noyes and his followers, who called themselves Bible communists, built the Mansion House, which would be the...
They called themselves Bible
They
communists.
called themselves Bible
That sounds like something you would call someone else.
Right? It
and
sounds...
not as a term of endearment.
Yeah, exactly. Fucking Bible communists.
Fuck.
But no.
He's owning it.
They called themselves that. And they built what they called the Mansion House, which would be the primary living space for members of the community, and included on its 14-acre property lots of public spaces to be used by both the residents and visitors.
Yeah.
They actually hopped on the tourist train fairly early on in their existence. They invited people to come stay with them in sort of a bed and breakfast situation that allowed folks to gawk at their unique lifestyle and help to fund their everyday goings on. Because obviously they weren't engaging with society at large. So everything that they did had to be really, happen on this property. And thus why they started doing things like creating silverware. They did like silk works. They invented the Lazy Susan. They did all kinds of stuff like that right here at this Mansion House.
You say that like I'm supposed to know what the fucking Lazy Susan is.
You don't know what a Lazy Susan is?
No, I do not.
What do you call the thing that you would put like on your table that spins, that has like salt and pepper and things like that, so you can like turn it? Yeah.
Fucking dinner wheel. I don't know. But thank you. I now know it is a Lazy Susan. Thank you.
Yeah,
like in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, at the beginning of Temple of Doom.
I don't remember that.
He's got the poison and the fucking diamonds and he spins it around and the guy. That's a Lazy Susan, right? Thank you.
That's a Lazy Susan.
Cultural exchange.
So the Oneida community, sorry, The Oneida community was communal in every sense of the word. Everything and everyone belonged to everyone. Everybody. Yes. Let me try that again. Everything and everyone belonged to everybody.
Okay.
You could have sex with pretty much whoever you wanted, but everyone slept in single rooms, and those sexual encounters were to occur in special quarters that weren't particularly comfortable, so as to discourage what they called sticky love. Noyes thought that to achieve perfection, quote, the new commandment is that we love one another, not by pairs as in the world, but en masse. A practice he called complex marriage. In other words, you weren't supposed to get too attached to one person. And the same went for having children.
So sticky in terms of attachment, in terms of relationship
not in terms
forming.
of like fluids.
Right.
Yes. Sticky love, falling in love with people. You're supposed to love everybody
and
with everyone.
Move on.
Yes. So on the one hand, Oneidans were super into eugenics, not in the create a white race by forced sterilization of undesirables sort of way that was actually fairly mainstream at the time.
Mm-hmm.
They believed in a doctrine called Christian perfectionism. According to historian Spencer Claw, quote, all that the perfectionists said was that if you totally accepted Christ, you would never behave immorally, and you would always act as God wanted you to act. The problem was that maybe this person who was perfect would misunderstand what God was saying. And of course, maybe that person was a hypocrite. Noyes understood that perfectionism needed to be regulated by someone who was able to interpret what God really wanted. So they were like, hey, we can selectively breed folks in this community to create perfect little unselfish socialist babies that will combat this capitalist hellscape and usher in paradise on earth with their perfect spirituality.
Oh, fuck. Whoa, roll back. So we're talking about breeding perfect Christians.
Yes, exactly. Taking the most perfect Christians in your community and
mating them.
Mating them. Yeah.
This is a new angle.
Yeah, right? Yeah. No. And they were like proto-eugenicists. Like, I kind of misspoke there. It's not that like that eugenics was common at the time, because we're talking about the late 1870s, mid to late 1870s. I mean, 1800s at this point. And like eugenics really became popular in the very late 1800s and early 1900s. And so their idea of like breeding people together in order to create a certain kind of human like this was actually one of the first functional experiments in eugenics that has ever happened.
I don't know if you can give me detail there, but what traits do you look for then? How do you decide who's ripe for breeding? How do you decide?
It's about the most spiritual and least selfish people in the community. Which of course Noyes thought that he was one of those. He also thought his own sisters were really perfect spiritually. Really wanted to have children with them. But thankfully that never happened. But what would happen is that Noyes would either arrange for certain pairs of community members to hook up and make it a baby, and other couples that were not handpicked by the man himself could present their case before a committee to be allowed to procreate. So in terms of like, what are these traits or things like that, they had to go up and be like, here are these traits that we have. Here's why we are.
So I'm not going to tell you what I'm looking for. You're going to tell me what you got.
Yeah. And if that matches up with what we're trying to do here, you can make them.
Make it a baby.
Make it a baby. And if not, no babies for you. And then
no sticky love for you, sir.
No sticky love. Once they had their babies, they were property of the whole community. They built like a nursery wing onto the mansion house. And if, for example,
so the idea of the notions of family, then, if I have a child, it isn't mine to raise. It isn't necessarily that baby is everyone is the family, everyone is the parent, everyone is okay, I get it.
Yeah, basically, they're trying to get past ideas of property and ownership and things like that, and selfishness. Ultimately, that was kind of what they saw as the problem with the world, is people doing things out of selfish motives. And a perfect Christian world would see no one doing things for themselves, but out of, a love for God and his people. So anything
Bible
that was
communists. That makes
Bible
perfect sense to me now.
right?
Jesus communists. Yeah,
exactly. And of course, it's a little bit of a bastardization of what communism is,
Of
but
course.
you see what they meant when they said that. And if, for example, a mom seemed to be getting too attached to that human being she just carried around for 9 months and pushed out of her vagina, they just simply wouldn't let her see her kid for a while until she snapped out of that sticky love. Yeah. In general, they weren't into letting
pleasant.
Yeah, they weren't into letting people get too attached to much of anything. One member of the community was a straight up virtuoso violinist, and they were like, oh, that's a problem. And they just took the violin away.
Oh, that's horrid.
Yeah.
You say this community, what are we talking in terms of numbers, in terms of scale? How many?
There was about 300 people in this community.
Harmless enough.
Harmless enough. Yeah, it's a very small, and that's the thing. There were a lot of these utopian communities, lots of very small utopian communities all over the United States, and you don't hear a ton about them because they were small. They were just little groups of people trying to figure out, like, how do we live? Again, what is an American? What does it mean? What is this country going to be? We want to create something that isn't like what we lived under in Europe that, we felt was oppressive, and we don't want to recreate monarchy. We don't want to create any of the structures that happened, before. And so this was just one of the many responses that people had to them. So there are various utopian communities. Oneida stands out because of their contribution being that they created a company that still exists to this day, and also, these practices, and being connected to the assassination of a president.
Which leads me to my next question. How does this flow in?
We'll get there.
Okay.
There's more weird shit about this commune, Mark. I'm not done explaining this to you. So one of my favorite practices of the Oneida community was what they called mutual criticism, which was when they would all sit around and literally just fucking unload on whichever poor soul's turn it was that day. A sort of proto-festivus airing of grievances.
Mutual criticism.
Mutual criticism.
In 2 words, you've just described my marriage. A process of mutual criticism. That's what it is. We've been that.
You found Utopia, Mark. Good job.
Keeping it alive, keeping those fires burning.
So in Sarah Vowell's wonderful book, Assassination Vacation, she highlights one particular member who was chewed out by the group for constantly talking about Vermont. And I know you never watched The Office, but most of our listeners probably did. And all I can think of is this guy being like Andy, who unceasingly drops that he went to Cornell at every possible opportunity, to the point where it's just cartoonish. And that's what I see of this guy. They were like, they said that he had too high of an estimation of New Englanders, and he talked about Vermont too much. And everyone was
how that would be irritating.
Yeah, everyone was just fed the fuck up with this guy talking about how much he loved Vermont. And so they held a mutual criticism session to.
But he in turn would get to fire back. Yeah, he would get to air his grievances.
Not in response to it, not in response, no. On another day, like, it was basically, your number would come up and everyone would sort of air out these things. And the idea again is to reduce selfishness, be honest about.
If it were my turn, I would have to like sit there before a barrage of mutual criticism. Mutual to me implies it's two-way. I would get to go, well, let me fucking tell you a thing or two, mate.
No, it means you will get your turn when it is whoever you want to criticize is, day. Yeah, you don't get to defend yourself or anything like that. You just have to sit there and go, okay, all right, I will try to adjust my behavior. Yeah. So yeah, but that's one of their more benign practices. Others were a little more unsavory or just baffling. For example, like I said, sex was encouraged between whoever wanted to have it. No hangups about it. And theoretically, a woman's consent was crucial. They were actually pretty forward about a lot of things with women. You had more rights as a woman in this community than you did in average society. And so a woman was allowed to say yes or no to whoever she wanted. It was an interview process, essentially, where it was like, hey, okay, this guy would like to have sex with you. Here's his qualifications or whatever. And a woman could be like, okay. However, it was the 1800s, so also it was considered kind of impolite to say no, and you
Oh, I
were kind
see.
of expected to just go with it unless you had a really good reason to abstain.
Hmm.
After all, the whole point of the community and all these strange practices was to rid people of selfishness, and not fucking someone over something silly like, not being attracted to them would be selfish.
I get
So it's consent with caveats, which, isn't consent. Also, as I said, they were real picky about who was allowed to have babies and when, which meant they didn't want a whole bunch of oops babies all over the commune. So to prevent this from happening, dudes just weren't supposed to get off. They called it male continence, also known as coitus reservatus.
I see.
So ladies could come to their heart's content, but guys, sorry, no can do.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, obviously it's not optimal, but on the other hand, again, it's the 1800s. It's a time when women were constantly getting knocked up and rarely having orgasms in the process. So in one sense, this was unheard of and progressive for them. Like, oh yeah, it's, a woman's supposed to come. A guy's satisfaction is not really, has nothing to do with this. But yeah, it's, obviously an issue. And things get grosser and decidedly less hip and feminist from there. And a content warning to anyone listening, it's about to get a little child molesty for a minute here. Yeah. In the Oneida community, when children reached puberty, they were considered to be coming into adulthood, and therefore Noyes figured they needed to be educated about sex. But instead of sitting them down in front of some diagrams and explaining the whole thing like most of us endured in 7th grade science class, Oneidans taught by doing.
Yeah.
An older member of the community would be assigned to have sex with the tweens. And it was especially important that women be postmenopausal, as young boys would have trouble controlling their ejaculation, and thus they required a partner who couldn't get pregnant. It's like a real extreme version of the parent who lets the kids party at home because they'd rather they do it in the house. The kids had to learn somewhere, so they controlled it.
I was down with these guys until about 30 seconds ago.
Yeah, it gets real sinister real quick. And this also is part of what broke up this group eventually, as people's kids aged and they started to realize what this was going to mean for their children. They were like, I don't know if we agree with this practice. So it was one of the things that was the downfall of the community. And obviously it's rape. I haven't seen any records at all of how children felt about this practice, but whether they were totally on board or not, it's not consent. A 13-year-old can't consent to having sex with a whole ass adult.
How long did this community, was this community a thing? How long
it lasted around 40 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
a fair amount of time.
To the early 1900s then?
It carried on until 1881.
Okay.
Yeah. And it started in the 1840s. So when it dissolved due to myriad issues, including lack of leadership, as Noyes' son, whom he hoped to hand it off to, lacked his father's charisma or even interest in his utopian cause, the company they created did carry on, and it still exists, even though it was sold to a European company in 2004. And to bring it back around to my fixation on James Garfield, we return to Charles Guiteau, who joined the Oneida community in 1860 due to his father's close ties with Noyes, and remained there for about 5 years. Okay. He proved to be too much of a weirdo, even for the Oneida community, though. And years later, when he tried to sue them for uncompensated labor he'd done while there, apparently misunderstanding the whole communal living thing, even his own father was like, eek, sorry about my kid, he's a fucking nut job. And Noyes said of him that he was, quote, moody, self-conceited, unmanageable, and addicted to masturbation. You're in a sex cult and they're like, this guy jacks off too much.
He would have been a shoo-in if he could just stop whacking off for 5 fucking minutes.
And Guiteau blamed Oneida for all of his life.
Could they not have just mutually criticized him out of it?
Yeah, I think I'm sure they attempted it. I imagine he received a lot of criticism, likely of the one-sided kind.
Quit with the whacking off all the time.
So yeah, he blamed Oneida for all of his problems. He sent them harassing letters and stated that his life goal was, quote, wiping out Oneida. But the wiping out of Oneida happened on its own terms, and Guiteau turned his attention to politics and managed to wipe out the president of the United States a mere 200 days into his term instead. So today you can actually still visit the Mansion House. It's become a museum and a bed and breakfast, much in keeping with its heyday. So for a small fee, you can sleep where hundreds of people had weird sex in their quest for utopia.
Terrific. And potentially where Charles Guiteau himself might have assassinated the president, if you know what I'm saying.